I'm Tara. I'm the founder of Bound. Um, so I am a book editor and I'm also the co-host of the podcast Books and Beyond with Bound. This is an author interview podcast where we interview our favorite authors about their creative processes. So we've interviewed, dream authors like Manu Pillai, we've interviewed Avni Doshi, Arsha Sattar, all the authors that me and my co-host Michelle DaCosta really love about their creative process. And we began the podcast, we launched it around March last year. And we've currently released 2 seasons of the podcast and currently recording season 3. And it's been quite a journey because we began recording in a studio, with a producer. We learned the ins and outs of how to make this podcast. And then the pandemic hit and we moved to online, and we will be continuing online even after the pandemic because it's so convenient. You can get to interview authors from different parts of India and even the world. So that's a little bit about me and the podcast. So Disha has just said, I don't have an idea at the moment for a podcast, but considering it for the future a little bit. So yeah, I would really like, if you guys could write down if you do have an idea for the podcast that you would like to discuss here. That would be very, very useful. Because as we know, you can use podcasts for a number of different things. Some of you here may be using it to build your brand. Maybe you all are entrepreneurs or you work for a particular brand, and podcast is a really, really great way to increase that brand value because it really directly puts you into the ears of your customers and your listeners. Or you could be doing it as a passion project, or it's something that you really wanted to do in terms of interviewing certain people and things like that. So please do type into the chat box about your podcast idea. I already discussed a little bit about what podcasts can be used for, and they're very, very valuable because they go right to your listeners or your customers' ears. So they're a fantastic and upcoming field. However, that being said, there's a lot of podcasts out there. And lots of people are coming up with different kinds of ideas. So how do you differentiate between those podcasts, right? It's not enough for us to say that, I want to do a podcast on mental health, because there may be tens or hundreds of podcasts on the subject, right? What is it that makes your podcast different from the other podcasts? The many different things that can make your podcast unique. One of the things that could make your podcast unique is you as a host, your perspective, what you bring to the table. This is especially true if it's you're an influencer, you're an expert in a certain field, and you're bringing in that perspective. You have you're a comedian, or things like that. Another thing that could differentiate your podcast is obviously the niche or your topic. So you really have to identify for yourself, big picture. I have an idea where I want to speak about mental health, but going into that topic, what is it that I want to cover? Do I want to cover body image issues for teenagers? Do I want to cover social media? The more specific and narrow you can make your big picture topic, the better. Because it's really that unique angle that will differentiate your podcast. As you must have seen, there are so many podcasts even about entrepreneurs, right? Interviewing entrepreneurs, but every podcast will have a specific angle. Maybe one podcast will talk more about failure and what entrepreneurs can learn from that, whereas other podcasts could talk more about funding and those sort of things. So to really establish yourself, and in terms of your own personal branding as well, as somebody, as a host who's bringing that perspective to a niche sort of topic, is a good idea versus going for everything, because we already have podcasts that do that. So you really have to think about that, and you really have to think, who is your audience? So when we started Books and Beyond, there was a lot of author interview podcasts out there, And we were like, what is it that's different, what are we concentrating on? There were podcasts that were talk about book recommendations, there were podcasts that talk about failure. So we really wanted to focus on the creative process. So in our podcast, as much as we ask general questions, we may ask questions like, what do you think the future of sci-fi is in India? We also try and always relate it back to our USP or our thesis topic, which is how do you, what is your creative process? And so the questions are related to that. Um, so Piyusha says, I want to start a podcast on writing for beginners for mental health and personal expression. That is very interesting, introspective writing, journaling, all of those things. And that's a very specific sort of topic that you'll be talking about. So that's great. The more specific the topic, again, the better. And always realize, what it is, who's your audience for this particular podcast. And it's not enough to just say, my audience is women, are they urban women, what are their consumer behaviors, why would they listen to your podcast? Really, when we started conceptualizing the podcast, we actually wrote down the vision, the mission, the target audience, the kind of guests that we wanted to call, so that we could come up with a coherent voice for our podcast. So this is just a little tip of the iceberg. And in the podcasting class that I am conducting, which is a 2-week class, we will go a little deeper into this. We'll go into how you can make a trailer, how the trailer is a very, very important part of the podcast. And at the end of the class, we will actually have made a trailer, and we'll also be going into recording do's and don'ts, the technology you can use, the marketing of it. I also want to talk a little bit about the recording do's and don'ts, because I know that all of us are recording online, obviously. So a lot of times people get very intimidated by, they think that you require a lot of equipment. Actually, you don't. There are a lot of platforms you can use, like Anchor and Zencaster, where you simply make an account, you log in, they automate for you a link, and you record your podcast. It's very easy, no technology needed. And I'll be going over some of these in detail: where to host your podcast, how to market your podcast, scripting, what kinds of things would you put in a script, how would you visualize a script. If it's an interview podcast, what kind of questions would you ask your interviewee, how do you call out the USP of the episode, and all of those things. So very quickly, some recording do's and don'ts. Oftentimes in conversation, we end up saying things like or right or okay or sort of those sort of things, and it's very easy to slip into that in the podcast. I would urge all of you to try and not do that, because it really does distract from the listener's whole interaction with you. Also, giving context is very important while recording. So if you're saying, I love that character, be specific, which character, what was the character's role in the book, because your listener doesn't know what you know. So it's very important to always bring your listener into the conversation. So giving context is number two. And number three is also, if you're moving around, that noise often comes into the recording. If I pick up a glass, and that the noise of the glass coming up and down, so all of those things, be a little mindful when you're recording. Pause for 5 seconds, as it's not a live medium, make your adjustments, then come back and record again, because again, it's very distracting. Don't wear jewelry, all of those things, and let your guests know the same. These are very simple things, but they make a very big difference while recording. Another thing is, sit in a room that doesn't have too much echo. Be cognizant of the fact that, is there echo in this room? Try and surround yourself with pillows and all of those things, so that the voice is absorbed. Because even these are very important things to consider. So, one is obviously the content, the choosing of the topic, the scripting, the actual recording. Then you also have you have the scripting, you have the recording, and you have the guests. You also talk about, we also are going to be speaking about, the marketing of the episode. So, writing the show note, for example, thinking of the title, because again, there's so much content that is coming in. How do you actually create that content that stands out? And how do you create an experience for your listener where they're not bored by you, where, you're modulating your voice, you're sort of creating this podcast avatar, if you say, where actually they're coming back episode after episode because of you, because you are an engaging host. It's like you're a host and you're inviting them to your dinner party. So, there's a lot of different sort of formats that you can even go for. And we're going to be discussing each of them in detail. Also, we are going to be discussing how to sort of create your own podcast avatar, if you will, as a host, and all of those things as well. So, before we go into the questions, I want to go to the exercise that I have for you. So, right. So I spoke a little bit about, creating this podcast avatar, because at the end of the day, you are the host of your podcast, whether it's an interview podcast or whether you're podcasting with somebody else. The listener is coming back to you. Okay, so Faiza's podcast is a kind of series of some content. Yes, so podcast is an audio clip, in a sense, is the easiest thing to describe. And you are the host. So if you start the podcast, you are the host of the podcast, and it's half an hour where you can either interview somebody, you can have narrate a story, you can chat about anything you want with a friend. So there are different kinds of things, and people listen in. And it'll also be very interesting if you guys could also type in, your favorite podcasts and why is it that you listen to them. Because before starting anything, it is always very important to listen to the things that are doing well, that we know are good, and important to critically analyze, what is it that they are doing that is that good. Is it something in the way that the host, is it the way the host is speaking, is it the way the host is asking the questions, is it the music, is it the length of the podcast, is it the kind of questions, is it the kind of guests, is it the topic, what is it, what are all those different elements that come together to make something really good. And in the podcasting class, we're actually going to break down all of those elements and analyze them a little bit in detail. But what I want to do is I want to talk about your podcast avatar. And it's very interesting because, in a podcast, it's you who's the host of the dinner party, and it's you who are getting that energy to the table. The energy has to be genuine, but it has to be sort of something that your listener would want to come back for. So really, what part of yourself do you want to showcase? Is it that you want to showcase your funny side or your creative side? Do you want to come in with a certain perspective? So I'll give you guys an example. My co-host and I, Michelle, do our podcast, Books and Beyond, together. And what was happening is that because we're such good friends, we realized that we were sounding very similar because we were agreeing on everything, right? So we would say that, we love this and we love that. And then at the end of the day, it sounded like both of us are the same person. So why is there a need for two of us, right? If we are both sounding the same. But so what we did was we decided, to bring in a little more of our personality. Obviously, we wanted to highlight our friendship, but we said, you know what? These are my strengths as an interviewer, and these are your strengths as an interviewer, and let's focus on those. And this is my perspective. I am coming to this podcast with the perspective of being a book editor and an entrepreneur. She is coming to the podcast with a perspective of, being a writer. So earlier, what we used to do was we used to write all the questions together and discuss everything together. Then what we started doing is we started scripting it on our own and seeing how our questions were different and sort of coming with that perspective. So it's very important also to, understand what kind of energy are you bringing to this podcast. What kind of perspective are you bringing to this podcast? Do you want to be more formal? Do you want to share a lot about your personal life? Do you want to share a lot about your life as an entrepreneur? Or do you want to share a lot about your family life and how does that relate to the conversation? What do you want to show off yourself to the listener? And that should be consistent as well. So, Piyusha, thank you so much for the compliment. I am so flattered that you are listening to the podcast. Thank you so much for that. So, what I want you guys to do is think about this exercise, and it's a fun exercise as well, where you doodle out your podcast avatar and you really think, you know, um, who are you as a host? And that is very, very interesting because, listeners will tune in and then they'll tune out, even if your guest is really amazing, because it also depends on your energy. So practicing that. Another thing that I would like to bring to your attention is that you know practice is also very key. So before going ahead and recording episode 1, do a few trial episodes and get prospective listeners to listen to those episodes and give you feedback. Only after you've done a few trial episodes would you then go ahead, and record and release an episode, because you need that feedback coming in. And hopefully in the class, we'll record our own trailers and we will be giving feedback as well.